Hello, everyone. Today I am joined by Guarnera, who is the founder of the blog Language Learning at Home, where she shares strategies and resources to help homeschooling families learn foreign languages well. A former classroom teacher with a PhD in Spanish, Anne is now a homeschooling mom of 3 young boys whom she educates bilingually. And when she's not with her boys or blogging, she's almost definitely reading, which I love. I can't wait to ask you later what you've been reading lately. She and her family live right outside Washington, D.C., where they enjoy visiting museums, tackling toddler friendly hikes, and making friends from all around the world. You can find her online at languagelearningathome.com, in her Facebook group, the Language Learning at Home community, and on Instagram at Language Learning at Home. And I am delighted to get to talk to you today. And I think this is such an interesting topic. But first, I would love to just get a little background. Tell us about your family and why you got started homeschooling.
Yes, thank you so much, Amy. And I'm very honored to have the opportunity to be a guest on your podcast. I'm a fan myself, so a little fangirling here, but I really do love listening to you. And I hope that whatever I can share today would be of use to your other listeners. You covered a lot of ground there in my bio, but I am married to my high school sweetheart, and we live right outside DC. We have 3 young boys. They're 7, 4, and 1. So we're still in our first years of homeschooling, but we have been bilingually homeschooling our oldest for the past 3 years. So there's a lot, in terms of the why, there's a lot of reasons why we ended up homeschooling. I remember sitting down with my husband and thinking through the decision, and I had a 2-page list of pros and I think maybe like 3 cons against it, before, as we were going through kind of a systematic process of decision making. The fact that I'm really at heart an idealist about education. Education has been so powerful in my life and given me so many opportunities. And I myself have been an educator in a lot of different settings, because I've taught in elementary school, at the high school level, and at the college level. And I've taught in different kinds of schools. So I've seen education, work out in a few different ways. And then when it came time to think about education for our own kids, I really wanted to educate them in a way that would reflect our family's deepest values. And since I couldn't find a school that would offer them a Christian bilingual education done mostly through living books.
It's probably a tough order.
It's like a tough order, yes. So I decided I would probably have to do this myself. And I actually have really enjoyed it from the start. So I do feel grateful for the privilege to be able to homeschool my kids and to do it in a way that really suits our family and our needs.
That is such a fascinating story. And it sounds like your sort of vision for homeschooling, the way you're doing it now, really was the driving force behind beginning homeschooling. Was there any way in which you feel like your philosophy of education or way of homeschooling has changed over these first few years?
That's a good question. An observation as well. I do think that our basic model has stayed the same, and it's working. So for now, so good, right? But we're only 3 years into it, so I think it'd be very interesting to revisit that question in about 10 years. But I think what's happened is we've added more kids to the mix, is that I have become a little more pragmatic in my approach by necessity. So, for example, with my first, I developed a very particular sequence based on what I know about language learning and literacy education, about, how we would learn to read and write. So we would work on reading in English first, since that's his dominant language and the language he's stronger in. And then we do Spanish. I had all this research to back up why we're going to do it that way. And that's what we did my first. But now my second born, who's 4.5 and is getting really interested in older brother's lessons, is starting to join in. And at this point, I'm working on reading in Spanish with my oldest. He can already read in English, and he's at reading at a basic level in Spanish. So my second born is kind of getting it in reverse.
Yes.
Just by pure logistics, I have come to observe, that I need to basically hold lightly to my grand plans and be patient with how things are unfolding. And I know deep down, even though I'm a planner and I love to plan, I do know deep down that it's probably all going to shake out fine, no matter what order we do these things. So I'm trying to hold on to that hope, even though I don't have that evidence quite yet.
And I think that's just a reality for every homeschool family with more than one child. You know, you have these ideals and plans, and then by the time you get down to a younger child, I think about this with my little guy who's 5, all the things I used to do with his older brother, my firstborn, that I haven't done with him. And I have to remind myself that nothing is outside of God's control, including the birth order of my children. And for all the things that I think of that I didn't do the same way, he's getting a whole different set of benefits from all those older siblings and getting to watch scary movies earlier than I let the let his brother and sister do it.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yes, you're so right. So it is a matter of trusting the Lord and that, these decisions that sometimes we hold on to and think are so important, really the Lord is going to work them out for his glory.
Well, Anne, what have been some of your favorite parts of homeschooling, and have there been any challenges to overcome?
My favorite part is definitely time. And that was one having lots and lots of time with my kids. And as well, just having a lot of freedom and flexibility with that time. So, with us being outside DC, our local culture here is very competitive, very pressed for time, and everyone is very busy and obsessed with doing more. And I remember being at the playground with my oldest when he was 18 months, and the go-to question of the other parents was, what preschool are you going to enroll him in so he's ready for kindergarten?
Oh my.
And that's just how it is here. And it's, you throw a bunch of type A folks together, and then they're type A parents, and then we're all a giant pressure cooker. So I do love DC and I love its energy, but I also appreciate that we get to live outside of that culture and that my kids don't have a lot of academic or extracurricular related stress. So them a lot of time and space to be creative in their childhood. And also, to be honest, it also saves me a lot of stress, because when we were looking at schools for my oldest and I was calculating the commute time to and from different schools and thinking about having to have one or two other kids in the car with me for potentially up to 2 hours a day, that was really overwhelming. And I thought, 2 hours a day, I can homeschool in 2 hours a day. So isn't that time for me better spent doing that than sitting in traffic?
Yeah, definitely. I don't think all that driving time would be worth even the audiobooks you could listen to.
Right. I know. I know. And so I have loved that about homeschooling. And I love that it's given my kids a chance to explore their interests and build relationships with each other, and given me a lot of time as well to work on my relationship with them. And
Time and relationship is such a gift of homeschooling.
it is, it's huge. It's huge. Um, and in terms of challenges, so I think you'll laugh at this, being a more experienced homeschool mom, but I've taught in a lot of settings, but I'm really used to teaching adults, and I love to teach adults. And they learn things really fast. What I didn't realize when I started homeschooling was that little tiny kids don't quite learn things so fast. So teaching them is much more incremental. And I've had to learn for myself to be patient with the process. And so when I started homeschooling my oldest, I honestly thought, and here's the part where I laugh, I honestly thought that teaching a child to read was like a 3-month process. So, you start phonics in September, and by December, they're reading the Chronicles of Narnia by themselves.
Of course, yes.
Of course. I mean, that's definitely like what my expectation was. And so I was wrong. And as I have learned how much work it really does take to learn these fundamental skills for kids, I've had to shift my focus. So I try and pay attention more to my own diligence and my own, showing up to do the work, to practice every day, and how I'm doing on that, rather than holding on to a notion of a timeline for what I feel my child should be learning on it, in any given subject. because whatever timeline I imposed, like that 3-month timeline, that was just made up out of my mind, and it was completely arbitrary. So I want to be careful that I don't teach in a way that ties me to those timelines and makes me either disrespectful of my kids as people and what their developmental needs are, or makes me over competitive and is like pushing them to perform just for the sake of performance, not for the sake of true learning. So again, being patient and learning to celebrate my kids' advancements as they come, as long as we're putting the work in, that has been important for me to learn and grow in.
I love what you said about focusing on your diligence instead of trying to impose an external timeline on your kid, because those things are not in our control. I mean, even with reading, I've been working all year with my youngest on, and I just keep, even after 5 times, I keep thinking, surely you'll get it by now, you know? And this morning we were looking at some letters and reviewing them. And every time he would say, Mommy, is that in the alphabet? It's like, yes, son, that's in the alphabet, the English alphabet, even. It'll be fine. But that's out of my control. But I do have control over my faithfulness. Do I show consistency? Do I show love and compassion and not get frustrated externally anyway? And that actually applies even to how I plan our homeschool for the older kids. You know, I'm not so much focusing on make sure you can get to the next chapter in your math book, but are you doing a little math every day? Because we may get to something that's tricky and we need to slow down. And I don't want that to feel to them or me like failure. That's the process of education. But we are going to be able to still be consistent and faithful and diligent every day. So it's kind of a mindset shift of like what your goals are and how you define success.
Absolutely. And especially when you're coming from an environment. I know you're a second generation homeschooler. I'm not. I don't have that experience of having been homeschooled. And so having come from an educational environment where my performance was all measured externally, and did I meet certain milestones on a given timeline, it certainly is quite a shift to, and a little scary, right? I mean, it is a little scary to say, okay, we're going to keep working at this, and I don't know if my child will be reading when his best friend is already reading. But I trust that every day we're going to do the work. We're going to pay attention in case there's a special need that needs to be addressed. But I'm going to respect my child's, personal development and like their personal achievement here, and not necessarily on the calendar schedule that I want.
Yeah, so good. Well, let's shift gears and talk about language learning at home, which I'm just so excited. I'm ready to learn a lot from you, honestly, because this has not necessarily been a huge strength of mine. So I kind of want to start with the big picture. Why should our children even be learning another language? Why are we having this conversation? And then what are our big goals for language learning at home?
Sure. So to answer that, Amy, I'm going to zoom way far out for you and your listeners, and then I'm going to dive in deep. So just hold on and bear with me here. But first, let me share for you what is my biggest why. And that comes from chapter 7 of the book of Revelation. And it reads, "After this, I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, were standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb.'" And I just love the picture of heaven that John gives us in these verses. I love to read that heaven is filled with people from all tribes and cultures and speaking all different languages. And in God's city, people from every corner of the earth will be praising the name of Christ. And by learning another language, I feel we have a really unique opportunity to be part of fulfilling that vision here on earth. So when someone asks me, why do you learn languages, or why should I teach my children languages? If you're a Christian homeschooler, I think that it's a powerful motivation to learn languages in order to befriend, to learn from, and to share the gospel with people who are different from us. Yeah. So that's really my big picture. And And there's many other reasons. So after we go for that, that's the vision that guides me in my work. But we know that there are many cognitive and academic benefits to language learning. We also know that there are professional advantages that it can provide to children in the future, and that it also gives us just a lot of opportunities to build relationships with other people. So those are all other reasons that are perfectly valid for learning languages. And so, each family can pick from those as they feel led, but those are, I think, the main ones.
And when we're incorporating this language learning at home, is our goal to have children who are completely fluent in a language, or when they leave home, or is there a range of acceptable goals that would be success in our homeschool?
There's definitely a range. And I think, in fact, I think that considering fluency as the only goal of language learning can be really overwhelming and unnecessarily discouraging to families. I think fluency is actually likely a reasonable goal only for a very small margin of families. Because to really be fluent in a language, you have to be immersed in it. And the opportunities for immersion during a kindergarten through grade 12 experience are just few and far between. So I like to talk about 4 different levels of language proficiency that families can pursue, and all of these have value. So the first one would be exposure. This is just simply helping your child listen to a language, helping them get familiar with a few words in the language, and learning a bit about the culture that the language comes from. The next would be conversational abilities. So this would obviously be working to train students to be able to have basic everyday conversations, things like ordering food, getting to know some basic facts about a new friend, or finding their way around a new place in case they're ever to visit somewhere where that language is spoken. The next level up, the third level, is proficiency. And so with that, I would include advanced conversational ability along with the ability to read and write at an intermediate level. And then finally, we have fluency. So when I talk about language learning at home, I'm talking about all of those 4 different levels, because you can pursue those things in the same way, but the level of intensity at which you pursue them and how much of your time it occupies. So I encourage families, when they think about this, not to get overwhelmed and think, well, if I can't get my child fluent in a language, it's not worth it at all. There are still plenty of benefits to exposing your child to another language, even if it's only for 10 to 15 minutes a day.
That is really helpful, because I do think in the back of my head, I've thought, well, if we can't sit down and have a lengthy philosophical discussion with, a guest in our living room in this other language, somehow that didn't count. So that's helpful to think that all of those have value and they're sort of steps along the way. And not to let, I guess, the ideal kind of destroy me trying something. Something is better than nothing.
Right.
Well, how do we choose which language to learn? And is there a good age to start?
Sure. I think I'll address your second question first. The best age to start is right now.
I love that.
Right now. So going back to what I mentioned about teaching adults, a lot of people think that there's a critical period for children to learn languages. And there's a lot of myths that have been built up around language learning that, if you don't start them young, then you might as well not even try. And we actually know from cognitive research that that's not true. So for those of you who have older children, you can be encouraged that older children use the existing grammar structures of their native language to more quickly learn the new grammar structures of a second or third or fourth language. And language learning also is a skill that builds upon itself. So if you already have some familiarity with one foreign language, then learning another actually is easier because it's the same skills just applied across languages.
I literally just got goosebumps. Oh, you mean it's not too late? I haven't ruined everything.
No, I mean, Amy, if it makes you, I learned Spanish as an adult. I was not raised in a Spanish speaking home. I actually learned it because I did such a bad job learning French. It was by accident that I learned Spanish. I had taken French in high school and did well. I got A's. I was in the French Honor Society, and when I got to college, I took my placement test the first week there as a freshman, and I bombed the speaking part because I couldn't speak it. And so they placed me all the way back in baby French. And so I said, well, if I have to start from scratch, I might as well do a different language. And so I started with baby Spanish instead, mostly out of spite. um, and so I can tell you from experience that it is absolutely possible to learn another language as an older child or adult. However, I will say that the thing that is hard for older kids, as I have seen with my high school and college students, is that they can be very self-conscious. They're already at a stage of life where they are so concerned with what others think of them, which is natural and normal. But having the courage to undertake a language at that stage can make it more hard. So if you start with a 4-year-old instead and contrast your 4-year-old and 14-year-old, a 4-year-old has no embarrassment about getting a language wrong or mispronouncing something, answering a question incorrectly. They're going to try and do their best, and they'll be silly and dance along to songs. And your 14-year-old probably won't want to learn in that same way and will be more cautious about taking risks. So it's not too late, certainly with older kids, but there are some special challenges that present when you are trying to teach to an older age.
Yeah.
So that's the age question, but I know you asked me also about how to choose a language. So when I'm advising parents how to choose a language, there are 3 things I generally ask them to consider. So first, I ask them to consider resources. Second, I ask them to consider motivation. And then third, I ask them to think about the practicality of the language that they're considering studying. So in terms of resources, I think it's important to take a look around and see what's available to help you and support you in your language learning journey. So does your spouse speak another language, or do you have other family members who speak another language and have the margin to converse regularly with your child? Do you have the funds to hire a language tutor? You don't have to be independently wealthy for this because the internet is an amazing place. And my kids actually do language tutoring with a Brazilian Portuguese teacher for a very reasonable rate. And it's been amazing. Another thing in terms of resources to consider is, are there teaching materials available in the target language that you can see yourself realistically using in your home? I don't recommend that parents try to pull together a curriculum from scratch with no spine whatsoever. It's fine to use a curriculum as a spine and then pull together lots of supplementary resources such as videos or magazines or books in the target language. But if you're trying to build a curriculum out of those things, that is so much work. I don't recommend it. I did it with my own kids with Brazilian Portuguese for about 2 years, and it was very consuming. So if you can, see if there is a book or series of books that you can use as a spine for your language learning, because that is really, really helpful. So that's resources. In terms of motivation, I think there's 2 main questions. What language is mom most excited about? Because I do think that our own interests and our own passions will transfer to our kids. So if it's something that you want to do alongside your children or lead your children in, then I think your passion is important. And then the other question is naturally, what about the kids? If the kids are totally checked out or totally excited to learn one language, that should be a factor as well. And finally, practicality. So to go back, to that vision in Revelation, and just my whole ethos of language learning is, we don't learn languages as an academic exercise. Like, we don't learn languages so that we can get better at grammar or get better scores on the SAT, or any of those other cognitive benefits. Like, those are there, but we primarily learn languages so that we can relate better to and serve and learn from other people. So will your family have an opportunity to use the language at any point, either now or in the future? I think that's an important consideration. And so those 3 things.
Yeah, that is really just a helpful framework to think through as you're processing those questions. Well, you've sort of touched about it a little bit, but does a parent need to know the language on their own in order to communicate this with their children? I mean, can we still kind of create an immersive environment at home or some semblance of that, even if we're new to the language as well?
I have seen parents do this, and I really admire it. So this isn't something I have done since I do speak the languages I'm teaching to my kids, but in my language learning at home community, we have a number of parents in that Facebook group who are doing this for their kids, and I am so impressed by them. And what they do to be successful is two things. They outsource everything that they can. And then second, they automate everything that they can. So in terms of outsourcing, they are really good at asking for help. So if they don't speak the language that their child wants to learn, they will find teachers online or find teachers who can work with their children in person and who, importantly, don't need a lot of oversight because they won't be able to determine if the teacher, is not the best. They need and give the teacher a lot of guidance. They need a teacher who knows what they're doing. But again, the internet's an amazing place. You can find those teachers. And secondly, in terms of automation, what those parents do is they make easy trade-offs to increase their kids' exposure to the language they're learning without creating more work for themselves. So this is something we've done in our family, that our children do not have screen time in English. They only have screen time in Spanish and Portuguese. And it's predominantly Spanish. It's very limited Portuguese. And that doesn't require any extra work from me, but it gives them plenty more of practice. And even with audiobooks, I will spend more money. I mean, I will get English audiobooks in the library, but I'm inclined to weight our audiobook budget towards Spanish language audiobooks so that when my kids have their daily rest time, they can be listening to those and getting more input and building vocabulary in Spanish when I'm not with them. And I've seen parents who don't speak the language that their kids are learning use the same strategies. Or they'll do something like they set up car time as time for listening to music in the target language. And they don't mind listening along, that's fine. And then finally, just one more thing I've seen parents do to automate it is that they help their kids set up systems to have ownership over daily language practice without requiring mom's assistance. So such as things like doing daily language practice through an app or with a workbook that has an answer key or with an online conversation partner. So again, not adding to mom's plate, but recognizing the fact that daily practice is really important to language learning and making sure that happens within a reasonable schedule, and has some accountability built in that's not from mom, but from someone who speaks the language or from a material that is created by a proficient speaker.
This is just taking something that can feel so scary and overwhelming and making it sound so simple and manageable. Like that's doable. Your kid already is excited about screen time. We'll have them watch in the target language. I can even imagine like an audiobook, especially if they were familiar with the story already in English, to, hey, do you want to listen to Henry Huggins in Spanish or whatever? And
Right.
just so there, it would kind of be that nice connection. And that's something that anyone can do. I'm sure libraries probably have audiobooks in some of these languages as well. Anyway, depending on what your family chooses.
Yeah, we found they have. I would say the one caution is I would wait till your child has reached some level of proficiency before you start throwing them into these materials, because just like if you sat me down in front of a cartoon that was in Mandarin, I might watch it, but I am not going to learn any Mandarin from that cartoon, right? I mean, maybe over the course of many years of being exposed to it, but I don't think I'm going to learn it just from a few times. And so I do caution parents to, wait until they have some proficiency under their belt. And then you can even start with materials that are directed at younger children. So on my blog, whenever I recommend resources, proficiency, they are 4. So some cartoons like the Magic School Bus is in Spanish, which is great, but that's really for advanced or native Spanish speakers, even though it's for younger kids. So if you have a kid who is learning at a lower level, then they might need something that's intended for younger children. And that might be, doesn't have to necessarily be something babyish. It could be a documentary with more simple language, but I think it's important to be cognizant of their language learning level before you start subbing in those resources just so you don't overwhelm them.
Yes, that is really smart. Well, how about the flip side? So we were just sort of talking about a family where the parents don't already speak another language in the home and are trying to encourage their children in language learning. But recently on social media, a mom had reached out to me. I think it was in a response to a post maybe I had shared. It might have been one of yours. I can't recall exactly. But she asked a question about language learning because she actually, English is her second language. So they have, I know it's sort of a naturally bilingual home, but she said actually she finds it really difficult to include her primary language, her first language in the homeschool, that she finds that they just pretty much default to English all the time. And so her children are not learning the language that you would, as someone who doesn't speak another language, I think, oh, if only I spoke another language, it would make this so much easier, but it can still be a struggle. So do you have any tips or strategies for the parent who maybe is bilingual but is still finding it hard to incorporate language in their sort of ordinary homeschool or family life?
Sure. I think the first thing I would say to those parents is I feel that struggle. Spanish is my second language, but I'm completely fluent in it. And even so, every day I have to remind myself to speak to my children in Spanish. And very importantly, require that they answer me in Spanish. And so that is something that is just like all of those daily parental tasks that you have. You're making sure your children do their chores, making sure they're using an appropriate tone of voice, making sure they get dressed, they get done all their responsibilities. That's one more thing that you have to be willing to add to your mental load to take on. But I think it's so worth it. And no adult that I know has ever regretted being raised bilingually. So I think that's an important thing to remember. But then from a practical standpoint, I think this is a really common situation because I've met also parents who struggle with the same thing. And the advice that I have is that I suggest that they use what's called the time and place method for introducing that other language and becoming more consistent in using it. So there's a few ways to work around that. I do know families who do school time exclusively in English, and then they make all non-school time in their other family language. So that can be nice if you have a school day that's kind of bracketed from, say 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. That's your English time. You already have resources in English. That's easy to go with. And then the rest of the time, you're working on your other language, you're interacting with your kids in that. That works if your kids are pretty competent in both languages. If they're not, though, because this happens with many families, is that English, our community language, kind of creeps in and crowds out what are, minority languages, or which are those that doesn't have to do anything with racial minorities, just the languages that are not spoken by the community. And so many kids grow up either understanding those minority languages, but not being able to speak them. And so you have to start at a lower level of expectation for what they can do with that. So in that situation, I suggest doing something like 5 minutes, start with 5 minutes of designated, say it's Spanish, it's designated Spanish time per day. And you work really hard at getting your kids comfortable in that language, using basic vocabulary and speaking skills with them. And you keep that up over a few months, and you add a few minutes and you add a few minutes. Maybe it gets to the point where you have dinner time in Spanish, and then you can use it and it will expand through your day. And that's a good way to ensure that kids don't become overwhelmed and just completely shut down and not want to use the language at all, because that is very real. That can happen. And it's a delicate dance between pushing our kids and helping them and supporting them as we come, alongside them to meet our expectations. And then finally, the third suggestion I have is if your child is proficient in both languages and the resources exist, you could consider trading off certain subjects into the minority language. So we do this just to ensure that our kids get enough Spanish exposure. I consider ourselves, because my husband and I are both non-native speakers, and because we actually live in a very largely Spanish-speaking community, but because our church is an English language church, and because most of their friends are English-speaking, we're fighting a tide of English. Like, we need to work really hard to use Spanish intentionally throughout our day. So we do a lot of our kind of bonus subjects at this point in Spanish. So that includes art lessons, music and art appreciation, and science. We do those all in Spanish. And I supplement a lot of our history and literature with Spanish books as well, or trade those out. Those already exist as resources. So it's not like it's something I'm coming up with. It's just, those are books that are already there, and I just trade them out, and it works really well for our family. So if that's something that's appealing, to just make each subject a different language, then that can work as well.
Those are really great tips.
Thanks.
Well, what if a child just is not clicking with the language, or they seem to really be struggling, or they tell us they hate it? How do we overcome those struggles, or what are some ways we can handle it or move through that, I guess?
Yeah. First, I think it's so important to know that that is normal. Even kids who are raised bilingual experience that. Um, and the reason I think so is because progress is so slow in language learning. It's like math, or even learning to read. It is so incremental. And as an adult, we may be able to have patience with the process. But I think our kids can get really frustrated by not having signs of progress, you know, at shorter intervals along the way. So I think as a parent, you can hold out a vision for your kids of what it might look like one day in the future when they can actually use the language that they're studying. Um, and so this is something that I think is much more powerful to show rather than tell. Um, I think it can be a little bit pedantic if we're, constantly telling our kids, like, you will use this one. Tell them that with every single subject. And it starts to lose its power, I think. So I think parents can do their kids a great service if they're able to show them a context outside the classroom in which languages are important and useful. So for some parents, that might be world schooling. That's great. Wonderful. But for parents who want to do something more close to home, this can be something that you tailor to your child's interests. So if you have a child, for example, who wants to pursue a medical career, have that child shadow a nurse friend or a doctor for the day, or even just talk to a friend who's a nurse or a doctor, and have them learn about how languages help that person in their profession. Um, I think that talking to other people about how they use languages, or even, this is powerful too, how they wish they could use languages, can be a really powerful motivator. And so I think as our job as parents is knowing our children, knowing their interests, and even for little ones, we can kind of know their interests, and connecting them with people who can show them a bigger context for the things that they want to do and how languages might support that, I think is so powerful.
Yeah. I love that idea to not just tell, but to show, because so often as parents, we kind of turn into the wah, 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 wah,
Yeah.
and our kids can tune it out. And so to think of another way of communicating those ideas to them so they can really catch the vision for themselves. So we're not just telling them, hey, this is the vision I have for you in language learning, but so that they get on board as well.
Right. And it doesn't just to add on to what I said, I don't even think it has to be, career related. Just to say, when my kids go to the playground and they can make friends who speak Spanish and don't feel comfortable in English, I say, look, you speak double the languages, you get double the friends. Like, that's a
Love
great,
that.
that's a wonderful thing, right? And that makes sense to a 4 and 7-year-old, and they love to play with the other kids at the playground. So they're like, oh yeah, this is valuable. Like, I'm glad I can speak Spanish.
Yeah.
So I think that is so helpful for them.
Yes, I love that. Double the languages, double the friends. It makes you want to go learn triple and quadruple the language. And I'm asking these questions to each of my guests this season. And the first one is just, what are you reading lately?
So this year, I decided I would go back and read some of the books that have been most important and formative to me in the last 20 years or so. And so right now I'm actually reading a book that I read when I was studying abroad in Spain, so my junior year of college, and I haven't read it since, but I remember being so moved by it that it has held a special place in my heart ever since. There's a lot of preamble, but the book is the book is Paula by Isabel Allende. And it is a memoir of Isabel Allende. It is her most autobiographical work, and she's a Chilean writer who's very famous and is part of the kind of magical realism movement in Latin American literature. But this work is more autobiographical. She wrote it at her daughter's bedside as her daughter was in a year-long coma, having had an attack of porphyria, which is like a disease of the enzymes of the blood. And so she wrote it as a way to reconstruct her family history, as something to give to her daughter when her daughter woke up, in case her daughter didn't remember anything about her family. It's a very powerful work. And I wanted to reread it because, I read it at 19 before I was a parent. And now being a parent, I think I'll have a much different perspective on it. And so I have really been enjoying that.
That sounds amazing. And also like a very difficult and moving, but in a good way, like difficult in a good way to read.
It is, but it's good.
Well, my final question for you is, what would you say to the homeschool mom whose day seems to be going all wrong?
I would say get outside. Especially during this pandemic, I have decided that I have to really live by the maxim, there is no bad weather, only bad clothes. So I have found being outdoors an instantly calming mechanism for myself and my kids. And so rain walks, great. Snow walks, great. I don't recommend ice walks.
A little dangerous.
What if you have skates?
Treacherous.
Yeah, a little treacherous. But otherwise, like, go outside and do it. And then, it on a hard day, I would say poetry tea time pretty much often turns my day around. Kids love cookies, and my kids love poetry, and so they consider it a major treat. I don't think they realize that sometimes I just do that to keep them quiet and eating things while I relax and read them poetry, but it works for all of us. We consider it really special time. And so those are my two strategies for a homeschool day gone wrong. And then just, go to bed, and tomorrow's a new day.
Yes, indeed. And this has been so great. And I can't wait to share this conversation on the Homeschool Conversations podcast. Can you let everyone know where they can find you all around the internet?
Absolutely. So my blog is languagelearningathome.com. My Facebook group is the Language Learning at Home community. And on Instagram, you can find me also at Language Learning at Home. I hope that's easy enough.
Yes, fabulous. And I'll have all that linked up in the show notes for this episode at humilityanddoxology.com. I'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Amy.